Hey, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good.
Where are you?
I'm in London in a lovely
Yay!
members club in bloody Soho. I flew across from Belfast this morning.
Hey everybody, welcome to AVA Online, May 2021, a series of conversations, and all conversations, as you would come to expect, about music and music within the creative industries. My name's Mark Gordon. I've been lucky enough to work on conferences and panels and keynotes and sessions and events for the AVA conference strand since day one, actually, both in Belfast, events at ADE in Amsterdam, and even, if you can imagine, as far away as Mumbai in India. So very fortunate today to be joined by Lucy Heyman, one of two authors of an extraordinary book, a very prescient book, and especially, I suppose, not only given the last 12 months, but the wider conversations about music and mental health that I suppose have been, really kind of bubbling away for the last 5 or 10 years. This book, Sound Advice, also has to be mentioned, a book made not only with the endorsement, but with the active participation of many of the music industry's, most important and key players. Lucy, I guess when I was doing some research, I understood where your co-author, Rian, was coming from. She mentioned the fact that she watched the Amy documentary, and obviously there was a bit of a sense that this issue was kind of hiding in plain sight in many ways, as to the kind of struggles that people had, not only with, I suppose, what would be more traditional, substance abuse or alcohol abuse and whatnot. I'm interested to know kind of what was your journey towards thinking about this book? Because as I understand it, you were coming from a slightly distinct place.
So firstly, Mark, thank you so much for having me today. I started off studying music myself, and I started with a career in music, working alongside the music industry. So I was working at a management company. As so many of us, when we start to have a musical career, you have to pay the bills by doing a day job. And so there were two things going on. The first one was that in my own musical career, I was experiencing a lot of pain when I was playing instruments and things. I was experiencing huge amounts of performance anxiety. But this is 20 years ago. And in those days, I thought I was quite unusual. And I remember doing a record company showcase and I forgot everything that I was supposed to be playing. I was so nervous. And there was no help for it, But alongside that, I was accompanying some pretty major international artists on tours. And I saw firsthand, firstly, the sort of grueling schedules and the fact that sort of every single day was almost penciled for the next 2 years. But also the pressures that came with that career. So this was quite early on, and I knew that it was something that was I was really passionate about. How can we support artists? And it wasn't really until about 10 years later, 10, 15 years later, that I was actually able to start doing things to make that happen. And I guess the key moment for this book was I was working as a performance and vocal coach, and a lot of the artists I was working with, the problems that they were facing weren't about necessarily how to sing better. At a certain level, so, artists are very accomplished singers and they need help with vocal health issues. But also a lot of the problems I was seeing were more around sort of like the performance anxiety sides of things, performance psychology, perfectionism. So I really wanted to be able to help the people I was working with more. So I enrolled in a course called Performance Science at the Royal College of Music. It was an MSc, and it covered all the health and well-being topics that research said musicians faced, as well as helping them to cope with really high-level performance, the peak performance strategies, all this kind of thing. But quite early on in the lectures, I remember them presenting a statistic and saying something like, 70% of musicians experience pain. And with my music industry background, I said, well, who were the musicians? And they said, well, it was classical musicians, of course. And I said, but what about pop? And they said, well, there isn't any research. And this just didn't make sense to me. And so I did some digging, and I found, the UK Music Survey, Music by Numbers, that comes out every year, and it gives a really good overview of what's going on. And that particular year, 94% of the albums sold in the UK were non-classical albums. And I thought, so all this research, support, and information exists for sort of 6% of the working musician population. So it was at that point when I suddenly thought, okay, I need to try and make some small change here, whatever change I can make, but it's going to start with research, advocacy, and I would like to create resources and sort of support systems and support mechanisms to make this change, and also to provide the level of support that I saw at that point in classical music, which it was so much further ahead. Health and wellbeing programs, books, videos, all kinds of things, a healthy conservatoires network. We didn't have that at all at that point. So I really kind of, that was the thing that really kicked me into action.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about that 96% that were essentially not served by this kind of thinking. I was reading the part in the book that mentions about, I think it's Kanye West's publishing contract, and the idea that as an artist and a creative, he's not allowed to take any kind of hiatus from his productivity. It got me thinking I remember reading the biography of the artist Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, and at the point at which he was, just before his tragic suicide, one of the things that was cited was the idea that these artists who are entering into these contracts, and of course there's a whole separate conversation about young artists and sort of punitive, exploitative contracts, but in a wider sense as well, that this part, the pop sector, there's no sense of kind of like building in kind of breaks and periods whereby artists can kind of take time off and sort of reflect, instead of which they're sort of obliged to keep feeding the machine. Now, obviously, this is, I suppose, in part because the nature of pop music is so ephemeral anyway, that it's kind of, it's like bottling lightning. But I just thought that was interesting, to look specifically about those constructs around how artists, let alone revenue streams, how they kind of enter into these things, not thinking that the creativity, which they probably consider to be a tap that will run infinitely, actually could have points that it dries up or that it needs to replenish and renew. But the nature of recording and publishing contracts often simply doesn't allow for that sort of break. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, as you mentioned there, that sort of ephemeral nature of kind of bottling lightning. In a research project I did, it became really apparent that pressure of producing a hit is just huge. And, and as you say, what makes a hit? Was it Britney Spears' Toxic went around God knows how many artists first because nobody thought it was a hit. And then for whatever reason. That has, in research we have seen that is incredibly stressful for the artists. And especially if they have a little bit of success first of all, and then knowing they have to continue that, and if they've had hits so far, how do they, as you say, how do they carry on creating those hits and creating that sort of track record when creativity is so hard to take hold of? And we have a chapter in the book about creativity for this reason, and we look at a lot of different people and their approaches to creativity, from Steve Jobs to Tyler Thwart, who was a choreographer, and also Julia Cameron, the author of The Artist's Way, and sort of tried to actually kind of look at it, paint a picture of what overall people are talking about when they are actually trying to offer people creative tools in these kind of books. That was a really interesting chapter. Rhiannon and I both wrote that one together, and we really enjoyed it. Yeah,
it's something that I think about a lot. I remember doing a Q&A with a Northern Irish musician, Tim Wheeler, from the band Ash. Yeah. This is a band who had a #1 debut album, very successful, headlined the Reading Festival, then had done a second album that was, kind of difficult to write, came out, didn't perhaps have the same sort of reception as album #1. And Tim, in a moment of reflection, was thinking about album #3, and still, fortunately for him, to be on a recording contract that allowed him to even make album #3. He had worked out that at that time, there were probably about 100 people who were relying on him to write a hit. Between booking agent and the publisher and the label and the manager and the other people in the band and the road crew and, people doing marketing assets and videos and whatnot. And I remember hearing that and thinking, I just can't imagine what that must feel like. Now, obviously, in that instance, he went away and wrote the song Shining Light and gave Ash, a much-deserved second act. But I can only assume that for many other people who are facing down situations like that, and kind of as the book talks about, it just must be mentally absolutely shattering to have that feeling that on your shoulders lies so much kind of responsibility. And the only way to kind of give yourself that second or third or fourth act is to then actually take that responsibility off and be creative. How does an artist reconcile that sort of burden with their core strength, which tends to be writing great pop songs?
I remember one artist saying, "I can only write songs when I'm sad." And I'm in a really good place in my life right now. I've got an amazing, stable girlfriend. I've got a really great, I've got a great life. And he said, I honestly think about ending my relationship with her, because I know that it will be so heartbreaking that I'll get an amazing album out of it. When you hear things like that, and I think one of the problems is that a lot of artists creativity is such an unknown thing, as you say. And I think a lot of artists are signed and they don't really understand their own creativity, how to access it, what they need, what support systems they need in place or not. Some people actually need a routine. They need processes in place to almost tell themselves that, okay, we're going to be creative now. Other people need that slight chaos and things to be really messy. And so I think there's a self-awareness around creativity that nobody is taught and it's just not discussed. And I think that is also, and research has shown this, that's one of the reasons why a lot of people turn to substances, because they think, well, maybe that will allow me to access the state that will allow me to write better or whatever. So as you say, it's just such a huge source of stress for musicians that is very hard to make it clearer and make it easily more understood. Yeah. But we are trying.
Do you think, one of the things I was thinking about was, is it even possible to kind of attempt, and I think the book, there's something about this in the book as well, to kind of recalibrate what success actually looks like from the perspective of an artist. Now, obviously, we know that the average musician's salary is, I think it's £23,000 a year would be what the average musician makes. So that's perhaps a little lower than some people might imagine. And also, we're very aware of the fact that whereas you might think that a musician, simply exists in the cave, writes incredible songs, goes out and tours, but actually oftentimes many people who work in music and in the music industry, they will all have portfolio careers. So they'll be doing a little bit of promoting, or they'll be, working for a blog, they'll be doing some stuff for free, there'll be kind of like some creative bartering they'll maybe do. Oh, I'll do your website if you can help me with some recording time and whatnot. So I was just thinking, is it possible to kind of recalibrate success in a way that celebrates that if you are, if you're full-time employed, even in that portfolio career in music, that you've actually got somewhere that in and of itself is incredibly hard to do. Forget about the Brit Award. You're making a living from music. That should be in and of itself celebrated more, should it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it comes back to this really strong core of self-awareness. What are the things that you need in your life? What are the things that actually truly make you happy? And I think it's important for all of us, no matter what career we work in, to take some time and really connect with that. Another one that I really like is asking yourself, what would your ideal day look like? Because you work with artists and they say, I want to be huge, I want to win a Brit Award, whatever. And they might love their local community and they're seeing their family and friends every single day or whatever it is. Are you prepared to tour the world and be away from your support system constantly? Are you prepared to maybe write a hit album and then only repeat those songs when you're performing, every single night? Because a lot of musicians find that really stifling. And so if you actually think what the day-to-day life of a really successful artist looks like, do you want that? And I think that idea of recalibrating success is so important. I don't think that this sort of outside world helps. I remember when I first started in music and there was so much discussion about whether someone had made it or not. And I remember thinking, it's just so unfair. People look at the creative industries like acting or music or whatever, and they say, oh, well, so-and-so didn't make it. And I think, well, okay, let's look at Bob over here, who's an accountant. Bob's got a great job and he's got a really great salary, but no one ever says, was he the best top 10 accountant in the UK? And if not, he didn't make it. Like, it's such a strange concept. But I think, as you say, like having that inner strength of knowing why you're doing what you're doing and actually you're happy with your success. I think when you go into a space where people are going to say stupid things, as long as you're happy with that, I think people pick up on that, don't they? And they sort of take it from you. But again, it all starts with knowing yourself, as you say, like what's important to you, and it's important to recalibrate that yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of the parts of the book that I really enjoyed reading about was to do with criticism and opinions. And obviously this is something that, I don't think we need to sell the idea that it's important to be able to kind of ingest criticism from lots and lots of different areas. Criticism could be from a contemporary, it could be from someone in your management team, it could be from a label, it could be from a blog, it could be from a troll. But yeah, I'm interested into digging into that a little bit more with you and kind of understanding, how do we deal, especially as a musician, with negative feedback, and I suppose especially negative feedback that's in the public domain. Now, obviously, I'm aware, bands like the 1975, voted in 2014 worst band in the world or something at the NME Awards. But I guess you can also distill that down to, being a kind of niche electronic producer, creating something and seeing it being reviewed really negatively by a blog that you really love. How do artists, people say, oh, you should just develop a thicker skin. Are there mechanisms that artists can use to kind of deal with criticism from the public domain? I'd love to know some more about that.
Well, you mentioned live performance there. And
okay.
I think just to take one step back, I think one of the most important things for a musician is to have a team of people around you that you trust.
Yes.
And to have some of those people at live gigs. And so one of the things that we speak about a lot in terms of like peak performance management and things is having a process of like pre-performance routines and post-performance review. Okay. So I think it all starts with assessing a live performance with yourself and your team, not necessarily like literally an hour afterwards, like give it a day or two, like let the emotions calm down and have an accurate assessment of what went wrong and why, and how you can change it and why. I mean, I know this is a very simple explanation, but I think if you can come to some kind of peace about your own performance, like, okay, that went wrong and this is why it went wrong, and next time I'm going to make sure that thing doesn't happen, then you're kind of like reaching a sense of kind of peace and understanding with how your performance went. And then at that point, I think you can then take yourself out with the understanding and the knowledge of why things went wrong. Alternatively, if you actually have your team around you and you've got great feedback and you feel like it was a really, really great show, again, taking some time to really like know that in yourself. And then if you go out and you see these other opinions, it's like, okay, right, that's their opinion. But I know for myself that I was happy with that performance, and I could see from the audience response that it was a really great performance.
Another thing that I wanted to talk about, and I suppose kind of spooling back a little bit from that idea of the full-time musician or full-time music industry creative who's earning that 23,000 or whatever they're earning, lots more, sometimes I'm sure lots less as well, is the kind of for earlier doors. I'm thinking people who are just starting out and they're having to do that thing whereby they're having to balance the kind of time that they can spend on music making and music creativity or, music performance and whatnot, with kind of working in a cafe, with a real job, with all the other things that are sort of going on in their life. We talked earlier about the idea of the kind of weight of burden that exists on someone who has had a lot of success and then kind of writing the follow-up hit and whatnot. But I'm equally interested, like some of the stories about idols and sort of, the work that members of the band were doing and the point at which they felt, okay, I can throw in the day job now and I can actually just like push all my chips on the table and go full time with music. It made me think a lot about bands and artists and people that I knew, especially who would move from the region, so they would move from Wales or they would move from Scotland or Northern Ireland, they would go to London, you know, all pathways lead to London, that's where the music industry is, and they would end up working, you know, in a restaurant or in a cafe being completely knackered. And actually what happened was all the creativity that they had ended up just completely ebbing away. So what I'm coming around to ask is, for people who are slightly earlier on in their journey and are balancing, you know, that compartmentalized part of time that they invest and put into music with just all the other stuff that exists through kind of being alive and doing stuff, how do you manage, are there methods or things that you can do, and mindfulness is one of the things that's mentioned as well, to make those periods of creativity be as kind of positive and as useful as possible for people? Because everybody is juggling so much other stuff in their lives, but it seems that, you know, music is like a muscle. You need to spend time with it. You need to kind of, allocate time. But it's hard if you come home from working the shift and you're knackered. What can you do?
Wow, I wish I had a really good answer to that question. I'll tell you what I can, but it's incredibly hard. And I work with a lot of artists who will do gigs at, you know, I'm thinking of one particular band who work around the sort of Leeds in the northwest area. Right. And they will, you know, they have a job in Leeds that they will tour all around the north, and you know, sometimes they'll do a gig and they'll be back home by 3-4 in the morning and be up for their job at 7.
Wow,
it's just not sustainable, and it's incredibly stressful. And I think this is why we see so many mental and physical health issues emerge, just purely because of the volume of the workload. Just a thing before the creativity. One thing I hear a lot is younger artists that there's just so much going on and they don't know where to start, and it's just so chaotic and disorganized. And I think setting some goals, being very clear about what you want to achieve overall, but also on a very short-term basis, right? So maybe it might even be, do you know what, this month I want to write a song, and actually writing down those goals, and just time management tools first of all. So you know, if you've got emails, like trying to organize your life and trying to separate your life into things like your day job and actually your music career. I find that people that has a huge impact on their stress levels and their ability to manage things, especially for people who, I mean, if they're going and working in a cafe, that's slightly different, but some people have like kind of freelance sort of side hustles or self-employed things that are bringing them money, and there's a huge volume of emails from that, and then there's a huge volume of emails from the gigs they're trying to get and the merch they're trying to create and all these different things. So yeah, I find even just introducing basic things like, you know, the Pomodoro technique, where you set a timer on one task.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about here?
I do not know this technique.
Okay, so the research suggests it takes something like 20 minutes to bring your full focus back to a task once you've got distracted. Okay. So you know that feeling when you're like writing emails, replying to texts, and you're doing all these things at once and you're feeling so productive. Apparently you're actually not being very productive at all. You'd be much better, especially if it's a creative task, you'd be much better to turn your email notifications off, turn your phone on airplane mode, and for 25 minutes commit yourself to one thing. And then apparently you have your full concentration and you're able to actually achieve that thing so much more effectively and much quicker. And then you basically break things down like this. So I mean, that basically saved me in terms of writing the book. Otherwise, it's far too overwhelming, right? But it can also work from a creativity point of view. So you can say, okay, do you know what? Everything is going to be switched off. I am not going to be disturbed. I am now going to just sit here for 25 minutes and I'm going to see what emerges. And either if it's noodling at the piano or if it's writing lyrics or whatever it is. But trying to get rid of those distractions and trying to calm the noise. There's an amazing book. It's Not Only Rock and Roll, and I can't think of what the author is, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
But the book is called It's Not Only Rock and Roll. Jenny Boyd, that's who it is. And she, I think, was going out with one of the members of Fleetwood Mac, and was spending lots of time with the sort of West Coast musicians in the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s. And she interviewed them all about their creative practices, how they get into a creative state, what they need in order to be creative. And it's the most amazing read. I mean, it's just like, this is what Joni Mitchell does. This is what Bob Dylan does, you know.
Wow.
And she has so many participants, and she wrote a PhD on it, actually. So the book is the result of her PhD research. But the main takeaway from the book was this idea that we all need to get out of our own way. So for some people, as you say, that might be mindfulness, it might be going for a walk, it might be meditation, it might be yoga, but we all have to find our way that we can quiet our brain and get into that state where actually we're not thinking about what we're going to cook for supper, or we're not kind of like, oh God, it replied to that email. And so I think it's quite a nice idea, because it means that it's not going to be a case of this will work for you. You know, you might already know that going for a walk for 5 minutes works for you better than a mindfulness exercise. So you don't have to do mindfulness, you know.
Right.
I find quite a lot of resistance sometimes of people saying like, I really don't like meditation, you know, don't make me do meditation. It's like,
Yes.
no, I'm not going to, you know. You probably know already what works best for you. And it really helps if you look back at times, maybe when you were most creative, and you think, what was I doing when I was most creative? Like, firstly, like, where was I? Was I on my own? Was I like in a room full of people? What had I done beforehand? You know, and all these kind of like, they say success leaves clues. So it's a case of looking back at times when it's worked really well, and maybe trying to recreate those times yourself.
Okay. Great. Listen, I mentioned at the start of the chat just about the involvement of the formal music industry and various players from, you know, major labels and streaming services and the live industry and whatnot. And one of the things that made me think about a little bit was, obviously, over the last months especially over the last, 12 to 14 months, with what's happened with the live sector as well, and I feel like there's been the lens of focus has fallen a little bit on streaming culture as well, and the kind of relationship between the major labels and the DSPs. Obviously the Broken Record campaign led by Tom Gray of the band Gomez, looking into kind of equitable remuneration of master recordings, and I suppose publishing as well. I'm interested, just while you're on, to get your sense of how you think maybe those conversations have affected the music industry and conversations around health and mental health in the music industry. We've obviously talked a little bit about, artists and getting paid and what success looks like and whatnot. Do you have any sense that these conversations around remuneration are actively kind of contributing to these, to these conversations around artists and mental health? And I suppose, because it slightly feeds into self-worth. And when I was watching some of the people being interviewed, Nadia Khan, especially, obviously, the MP's inquiry, you got a sense that what the artists were saying was, I just feel like the industry is not valuing my creativity in the same way as it would have been valued historically. And setting aside the whole kind of conversations around the digital revolution, we are where we are now, and if streaming hadn't happened, many people would say the industry would actually be on its knees. But what do you think those conversations have had by way of an effect on kind of music creators? Can you feel any effect or not?
Well, one of the things that I've seen just in the wider community is actually people being very honest about what their incomes actually are. And I mean, I know in the work that I do, people have, there have been external people who don't work in music say, well, why are you supporting musicians like, all these kind of amazing stars? They earn huge amounts of money and they have these incredible lives. And I think there's a real ignorance about actually how tough the career is and how little people get paid. And when you hear artists in that inquiry saying, I'm a Mercury nominated artist and I cannot pay my rent. That's really sobering, and that is not. If that artist cannot pay their rent, like what are we? How can a sort of an artist at a lower level survive? But I think it has started to make people more aware of how financially precarious the industry is, and I think as a result of those conversations, financial stress is just absolutely huge in the picture of what your health is going to look like overall. And obviously, thankfully, we've got some amazing charities, and there's been some brilliant hardship funds that have supported musicians, over the last year. But that reliance on touring as well, like taking away the touring, I think has really shown us how it's just not viable. When I started in music 20 years ago, obviously it was more about record sales. And it's just in such a short period of time that the model has completely flipped. But also that reliance on touring is just so incredibly stressful for a musician's health. And we need to, I think people have started to realize that we do need more of a balance. People cannot be out on the road permanently because that's the only way they can make an income. And as you say, in terms of creativity and how people actually are able to even get into that headspace, for some people, being on a tour bus and being surrounded by people all the time and being physically exhausted, because that's really the nature of touring, isn't it? That is not conducive to being able to write a great next album and embrace your creativity. But yeah, it's an interesting time. What do you think? Have you seen any kind of
I suppose,
change?
and by the way, I think it was Nadine Shah. I've just realised. I think Nadia Khan is bat for lashes, but it was Nadine Shah who I think was interviewed in the parliamentary committee. I suppose what I've seen from emerging artists on my timeline on social media, yes, is that sense that what they're feeling when they kind of look at this content is that they feel less valued, that they look at where they are now in 2021, and it's a thing that people, in the same way as people naturally future gaze, there's always rose-tinted glasses when it comes to the past. And I think, it's interesting, there's so many issues that are now coming to light about how the music industry operated in the past. However, values, especially around master recordings and master recording rights, historically, it's difficult to argue with the fact that there were different value attributes. And those value attributes now are such that artists do feel they're coming into an industry and it couldn't be harder. Now, the irony of that is it's easier to make music, it's much less expensive. All those sort of barriers towards kind of consumption and putting music in the public domain no longer exists. So in many ways, it's kind of freed people up to be more creative and have that creativity accessed almost immediately by other people. But yes, I do think that these conversations over the last 12 months have definitely led to a feeling within the music community that is centered around core value of artists and artist rights. And I'm not sure beyond the kind of actuality of that, what it means in terms of creativity. Because I suspect musicians and music creators are never going to want to stop wanting to make music. I think, as I'm sure you probably agree, personally, subjectively as well as objectively, it's something that you wake up one day and you just realize, this way my life and career points, and that's all there is to it. But I'm not sure what to do about that, and I'm not sure how that makes artists feel.
Yeah, I would just add that, from some of the artists that I've worked with, I think the value and the meaning comes from the fans and the relationships with the fans. And I do still see that a lot of positivity there. I think it's the fan relationships that are keeping musicians going, as you say, at a time when the industry is not valuing them. But it's really, really tough. People should be valued for what they do.
Yes. I want to talk, just before we finish chatting, I also want to talk about some of the work that you've done, the work that you do with musicians, which is actually setting aside this whole idea of the kind of role of mental health in a kind of musician's career, an artist's career, or music industry person's career. The idea of, which you touched on at the start, especially with the classical community, of physical issues that musicians have. So musculoskeletal, MSK issues, which can be prevented fairly easily, and then also issues around vocals and singing. So could we start with the former first? I would love to know just a little bit more what that means, and are there simple wins that artists can take? Something like 74% of musicians experience these issues. So yeah, I would love to get some advice on that, and then we're going to talk about voices and singing.
Well, I think that statistic just sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it? 74%, that's nearly 3/4.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
And what that actually translates to is that the vast majority of musicians experience pain every time they play. And this pain can be managed, and it can get worse, and it can actually end careers, and all the sort of difficulties that or cause career breaks. But the frustrating thing is, there are lots of simple things that you can do to manage that. So one of the most simple things are warm-ups. So musicians, a lot of musicians just pick up their instrument and just start playing straight away. It's literally like looking at your body like you're an athlete. A sports person would never go and do exercise without warming up the muscles that are going to be used in that period of time. So it's about finding the right warm-ups, actually like sort of from two different aspects. The first is actually warming up your body, and the second is actually warming up, so actually physically warming up your lungs and things, and then the second one is warming up the muscles. So there's a great musician's physio who I work with who says, like, before you're going to practice, just like go and like really like briskly walk up the stairs and down the stairs a couple of times. Like that gets your body physically ready for performance. And then of course there will be, if you're a wind player, it might be things like long notes to start kind of getting your lungs used to what you're doing. Or scales, whatever it is. But there is so many resources about this. So there's the British Association of Performing Arts Medicine, it's called BAPAM. They have so many warm-up sheets on how to have an effective warm-up depending on what kind of instrument you play. But there's a lot of research now about cool downs as well. So again, just like athletes will do a cool down at the end of their sports session, there are instrument-specific cool downs again, which will prevent you injuring yourself. And another huge one is the length of time you play. So I know we spoke about like the length of time you might be having like a Pomodoro creativity session, but that time also extends to practicing your instrument or practicing in any kind of vein. So the two things that you're trying to do with performance is with practice is to make sure that your concentration is really, really good and your focus is really good. But you need to keep it under an hour, but ideally kind of around 30 minutes, to reduce the chances of having injury in a practice session. So there's been loads of research on effective practice. If anyone's interested, just like Google effective practice or look on BAPAM's website and things. We've got a section in the book about it. And also, I think it's really important for the return to performance, like that bands don't just go and book out a practice, rehearsal studios for the week before a gig and just go, right, here we go. This is us. We're going to do 6 hours a day to prepare for going.
Yeah, and then expect to be match fit.
Yeah, because that's probably going to result in an injury of some kind, So it's got to start. You've got to build it up slowly over time to prevent injury. So another one, vocal health is absolutely huge. I've been called in on quite a lot of tours and things when people seem to call in vocal coaches when problems have started, which is it's the worst time to call in problems. So right. It'll be a case of, okay, this singer's got to go on stage tonight. She can't speak. Can you get her on stage? That kind of thing. Whereas if it's just so like, it's so important for all artists, if you are a singer, to have an MOT check-in with a vocal coach. Like it could just be one session to check that you're singing in the right way and you're not doing anything that's problematic, that you've got a warm-up that is tailored to you. Because again, if we look at like an athlete, different athletes are going to need different warm-ups depending on what they're doing. And it's the same with singers. Like someone who's belting every night as a female sort of soprano type voice is not going to need the same warm-up. I would say someone like bassy, like Rag and Bone Man or whatever, and so they need to have targeted warm-ups and targeted cool downs to protect their voices as well. But so I think if we look at, again, we've just spoken about so many things about that are stressful for a musician, but these physical pillars of being able to actually get on stage and do your job, like they are so important. And it always shocks me the amount of people that I work with, that I'm, as I say, called in kind of further down the line, who are having stadium careers, who haven't had a session with a vocal coach. I mean, it's astonishing. It's kind of, as you say, it's all, it's almost laughable. But that anxiety and fear from a singer about losing their vocal health, losing their voice for a tour, it's so stressful. And it's something that is, again, just so preventable. But I see a lot of people, as you said, you mentioned about Tim Burgess kind of relying on that him writing a hit to sort of support all these people. You know, if you look at the machine of a tour and you think of all the crew and all the staff, and if a singer loses their voice, all of that has to shut down for a night. You know, it's amazing that it doesn't get more attention and people aren't more sort of prepared to prevent problems happening. But again, it's probably worth mentioning. I've spoken about quite a lot of resources, but we have a resources page in the book. There's a thick resources section with all the kind of different organisations where you can get information about this. But we've got a resources section for free on our website, so anybody can just go soundadvicebook.com, click on the resources tab, and then, you know, vocal health resources, the best people to go and see, you know, all that kind of thing is all available.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. So final question, I suppose, and one that's very prescient and, you know, close to AVA's hearts, I'm sure, is the idea, you know, as briefly mentioned, so the return of live, so the return of, you know, the return of club culture, the return of festivals, the return of gigs, the return of touring. You know, AVA, you know, grew out of the live electronic scene, I suppose, in Belfast. You know, people like Space Dimension Controller, obviously Bicep as well, now Brit nominated Bicep, and has, you know, hosted some huge parties, many thousands of people having a phenomenal time. All around the world, and we're now looking, you know, the door has there's a little ray of light in the door, and it's maybe going to be continued to be open as we have these trial events going on for everybody who is returning to live. So for the consumer, for the public, for the audience, for the DJs, for the artists, for the electronic musician, let alone, as you just said, all those other people who are working in and around the live sector. It's probably going to be the case that there's going to be a fair amount of anxiety about the return of live, obviously tempered with just joy about the reopening of something so kind of culturally and emotionally important. I'm just wondering, you know, as a final thought, you know, anything that, you know, any thoughts that you would have about the return of live and about how people can best navigate this sort of strange new paradigm that we're going to be existing in. You know, you look at kind of, you know, the face mask test event in Spain versus the Blossoms show in Manchester, you know, versus the Brits, you know, only last night in London, 4,000 people. What can musicians, the music community, you know, and people just going to gigs and clubs, what can they do to sort of, you know, I don't know, better prepare themselves for the return of live after such a hiatus? What do you think?
Well, if I start with musicians, I'm hearing of a lot of people who are very, very anxious, as you said. And I think part of that as well is just the uncertainty about when it's going to be. You know, we're sort of thinking, yay, everything's opening up on, you know, Monday, for example, May the 17th. But that isn't, as we know, with Glastonbury and so many festivals, that isn't translating to a just straight return to live music. And a tour manager that I work with, you know, some of her artists' big tours that are planned for autumn have now been rescheduled again, for whatever reason that is. So I think there's two aspects, isn't it? It's managing that uncertainty and managing that knowledge. You know, does an artist go out and get another part-time job or whatever to cover them over that period? I mean, it's that aspect of it is seriously challenging, and there is no, at the moment we don't have clear guidance on all of that. From the actual performance side of things, in terms of managing performance anxiety, like there are so many experts and people you can work with to actually work through the sort of performance anxiety aspect of returning to live performance. And, you know, I think it's a case of building up slowly. And like I said, with the practice, start in small amounts. You know, the first gig you do, maybe make sure that it's something really local, or where, you know, where you've got a crowd that you know. Like, don't just go back into like the biggest show and just expect to be able to be okay with that. And I'm not a psychotherapist, so for people going back to shows and all that kind of thing, like I would sort of defer to professional advice, but I would imagine it also has something to do with trying to be honest about what you're comfortable with. You know, there are some people, even friends of mine that we've been speaking about, parties. It's all the 40th rounds at the moment, you know, people who've been lucky enough to have them at this end. And some friends are, as you say, raring to go. They're like, oh, just let's get on with it. Let's get in a room with friends and just do this. And others, like myself, I am quite nervous, and I don't know how how I'm going to be. And I think we've all just got to be honest with each other. One of the huge benefits of this last year, I think, is that we have started normalizing these conversations. You know, people have started saying, you know, I'm having a really difficult week. I really need to sort of go slow or whatever. And I think people would be totally, you know, support groups and friends and whatever, you know, I think if we're just all honest and say, yeah, I just need a bit of time. Maybe it's going to be a small event first for me. Maybe it's going to be something outdoors that I can leave quite easily. Maybe it's, you know, like a sort of live music in your local pub or whatever. And you can come for 10 minutes and see how you feel. And it's, I think building up slowly, not just expecting that you should be able to cope with everything straight away. Yeah,
no, I think that's a great way of looking at it, and that idea of the kind of like truthfulness of the conversations and the honesty, and I suppose in many ways, you know, that's kind of emblematic of what the book is about, and kind of opening up conversations hitherto, you know, perhaps for many different reasons were too difficult to kind of chat about and to be open. As you say, it's one of the strange kind of things about the last year or year and a half that could be seen as being a positive. So on that positive note, the book is called Sound Advice. The authors are Rian Jones and Lucy Heyman. Lucy, on behalf of AVA, thank you very much for taking some time to chat to us today about the book, and cheers.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's been great to speak to you.
Okay.